Meeting at the crossroads where the two forbidden subjects of politics and religion intersect. This is the Sophie Scholl Roundtable. And talk about an intersection. Today, as we saw last week, we have two evangelical Christians and two that are not in the camp of evangelical. In fact, they would consider themselves atheist agnostic. But we can talk about it. Talk about it in ways that reference our political beliefs and to be able to do it in a very civil way. Kind of way that Sophie Scholl liked to talk about it when she was in Nazi Germany and allowed, invited differing views to be voiced and aired. And we should be adult enough to be able to have these kind of conversations so that we can be like iron sharpening iron. Interesting, I heard Dennis Prager, Orthodox Jew, make this statement. He said, liberty is a value, not an instinct. Liberty is a value, not an instinct. And he said it in the context of hearing a speech by President Biden talking about all these freebies that were being offered by the federal government. These investments, so to speak, which I called, no, you're taxing other people to make investments. But I couldn't help but notice again that phrase he said, or that sentence. Freedom is a value, not an instinct. Safety would be an instinct, he would say. And I think what is said regarding what government promises plays into an instinct that is more readily to receive funding from government than a person who is more alert to issues of freedom that would say, whoa, watch out. We got to value freedom here rather than taking the instant gratification of having a need, want met provided by the government. Anybody want to comment on that?
Well, it makes me think of, and I didn't even know this was a thing, but I guess it's still kind of going. Trump started it, a program to where, when half the country's hospitality industry shut down, a lot of food supply chains backed up. And I guess this was a way to sort of subsidize the farmers and the food producers that were losing some money. So the federal government bought a bunch of basic stuff, like meat, cheese, produce, canned goods, and all over the country, these boxes of food were being handed out. They did a few in Jamestown.
You're right.
And it just floored me that under Trump, and Trump supporters were touting this, and I'm like, don't you feel a little odd? I mean, yeah, it's a pandemic, and times are tough for some people, but doesn't it make you feel a little weird going and getting food from the government? And it was not restricted, and that's the thing that I'm like, okay, for the people that if you can prove that you're on unemployment or you lost your job, no, they were handing it out to anybody. I could have went down there. I've made more money per week in the last year and a half than I ever have in my life. I could have went down and got in line for one of these boxes of free Trump food.
Yeah,
but I didn't, because I have a value of freedom,
right.
And I just said, no, I can't in good conscience do this.
You can go down to the soup kitchen every noon and get a free lunch.
Yeah.
Free lunch. Free to you, but...
Right, yeah, you can go right into St. Susan's and they'll serve anybody.
That's right.
They will.
So does your social economic conditions change what you value?
That's a really good question.
Because I myself, I'm an accountant, and my job wasn't affected by the pandemic. I could work at home just as easily as I could at the office, and everybody still needed their tax returns done. Companies needed financial statements. So financially, I weathered the pandemic storm no different than I would have if it hadn't occurred. But a lot of people had serious economic problems. So very much like, I would have had, I'm not a great speaker. I'm trying to think of the right word I want. I value freedom, but if I'd lost my job and my house was on the line, I would very much value that box of food.
But let me ask this question, Sam. Would you rather that box of food came from President Trump, who you kind of alluded your feelings to, or the federal government, or like Kyneton Congregational Church, or a group of your friends getting together that knew you were down on hard times and putting a box of food together out of their own money?
Would I have a preference? I don't know that I would have a preference if I was desperate.
Right. I guess if it's a desperate situation, but
yeah.
I mean, I personally, I know where you're coming from. I understand the situation that desperate times call for desperate measures, and it changes your perspective on charity. You might not really care who it comes from, but I don't know. Maybe I think too deeply about everything, and I think I personally would think too deeply about that.
Are we talking about what somebody would think, or are we talking about a philosophical absolute here, or what really is? I have trouble understanding what you mean and what Prager mean. My freedom's an instinct, not yours. I mean, that's human nature. And I don't really know what you mean by, or he means by a value, Prager, in this context. What did you mean?
Are you talking about a selfish value of freedom?
Well, I mean, the word value, I don't really know what your definition is here. I mean, it's an instinct. It's natural for me to want freedom in as much as possible, but not to care about yours.
Right, right.
Hey, if I can make you build that fence for me, that's fine. I don't care about your freedom. It's just mine. I don't want you to make me build yours.
I should be able to travel to California if I want to, but you can't come across the Mexican border.
Well,
yeah, I don't know. He didn't define value there, but I thought as I listened to it, people, I think, are more inclined to at first take care of the instinctive aspect of making sure you have food, shelter. So I almost feel like...
Could you state anything more obvious?
Yeah, right. I do have a tendency of doing that, don't I, Norm? But I feel like the aspect of freedom is something that you always have to be vigilant about, because it can be so easily frittered away. Rather than, would people be more inclined to give up freedom or safety?
Human nature?
Yeah.
Oh, freedom.
I see. I agree.
I think we've seen evidence since
Human
9/11,
nature,
2001.
no, safety. It's natural to prefer safety
Yep.
over freedom.
Yep.
Right, that's what I said. They would
Yep.
give up, and I
Yes.
think we have empirical evidence for we've sacrificed
Well, it's a
freedom
survival
for the
value.
promise of safety,
Evolution.
not even real safety.
It's obvious.
You credit it to evolution.
Well, of course. It's a survival value. You look out for your safety, you're going to survive to have offspring.
I go right back to Genesis.
Well, that's your problem.
I know. No, I think that's a good problem. Because there in Genesis, we see that aspect of freedom. Freedom was there. Freedom was very much present. Yeah, it was conditionally safe, but freedom is good. That's good. And as that goodness of freedom existed then, the component of safety sure factored in, but it was a conditional safety, not unconditional. So that you see what man can do to freedom in spoiling it, in ruining it, in falling into temptation and wrecking everything.
What is your point?
What? Thank you, Norm. I guess it goes back to safety. Norm, you're really making me think, and I appreciate that. Safety becomes really instinctive after the fall. Mm-hmm. And freedom is something that is good, but man doesn't really see.
Well, before the fall, that's your imagination. You can have it any way you want.
Well, how would evolution explain freedom? That is, how did freedom come about through an evolutionary worldview?
There again, the individual's looking out for his own benefit. And safety is just one of those benefits. But in the absence of danger, there could be many other things that a person wanted to do. And the things you want are the things that contribute to your survival and reproduction. It's tautological.
I think if we all were just acting on evolutionary survival of the fittest type of instincts, we would have destroyed the human race a long time ago.
We've come darn close.
I think there's got to be something, nature.
We may well do that. This new post-modernism, cancel culture, and so on may do that. It will destroy. It can destroy civilization, and I'll tell you that can destroy the human race. Because you throw us out in the woods without any clothes or shoes, we couldn't even walk, let alone survive. And when there aren't competent enough people, and people are stupid enough to push this kind of idea,
but in
that
your
will
world,
destroy civilization.
In an evolutionary worldview, we were there already, though, and we've gotten to this point just fine.
Yes, but
so why can't it go in the other direction?
Eventually, all species, from an evolutionary perspective, meet with circumstances they can't cope with. They go extinct. Mm-hmm. It'll happen to us too. Mm-hmm. And this may be it.
Maybe. I don't know. My point was just like if there's other things that exist like virtue and logic and morality that I think come from a higher power, from God, that have sustained us longer than we would have if we were all just acting as evolutionary animals.
Well, people in all kinds of different religions, and no religion, philosophers, ethicists, they can come up with morality and proper social behavior and good manners. They can come up with a lot of other things too, but I don't see why you have to posit a Christian religious perspective to any of that.
Why don't wolves have morality?
Well, they do in something comparable to it from a survival standpoint, same as we do. That their behavior is shaped by survival advantage, just as ours is. The question of how our moral principles are derived from or influence survival value is a very complex one. I've read a lot about it, and there's a lot more I haven't read about it. So I really don't see what your point is.
Well, I was getting to, we share certain things with wolves, like we have a spinal cord, we have a brain, we have a circulatory system.
And not only that, we're social mammals.
Yep.
Yes.
But there is no higher conscience in a wolf, or what we call a higher conscience in a wolf, or we haven't seen any evidence for it. But we have that, and from an evolutionary timeline standpoint, human beings and wolves are about the same distance from the common ancestor.
Well,
right?
we're unique in that we are the only species that can cooperate on a broad scale beyond kinship. And a big part of that is our possession of language. But nevertheless, that, of course, that means that our optimum behavior, including our social behavior, which is dictated in part by our moral principles, has different evolutionary forces acting on it. Different, much more complex factors are involved in the survival advantage, in the selection pressure. It's perfectly consistent with evolution, and I can't see a religious element in it as anything more than a violation of Occam's razor.
Sam, you have any thoughts?
I'm very much in agreement that you don't, and maybe in regards to the wolves too, you don't need a religion to create a system of morality. I think morality, we're a social people, so it's too, interestingly, there may be some selfish tendencies to that, but it is in our best interest to figure out a way to live with other people so that we survive, they survive, nobody is hurt. I look at morality as a factor of well-being. So it could be, in the case of the wolves, they may not be able to reason, or whatever better term, at our level. They still may understand the concept of how to work together to survive. So I would, and what their process is for coming up with that, I don't know. Me personally, I would much rather have and this is something that Richard Dawkins once said, I'd rather have a moral system that was thought out, reasoned, discussed, and agreed upon than a moral system that is essentially a dictate or an order from some centralized power.
Well, as I specified before, we're unique in that we can organize on a vast scale beyond kinship limits, and that we do this with language. Well, societies that have placed a lesser value on watching out for your neighbor, or lesser value on organized patriotism or group efforts or so on, those societies have been at a disadvantage evolutionarily, in the survival of their tribe or their society. So it's still the same thing. It's survival value and natural selection.
So I think we agree that morality is something that's real and necessary. But I think we just disagree on how that is derived. And why?
You're taking a cheap shortcut.
A cheap
Yeah, well, that's the story about religion in so many ways. You say, well, you scientists can't explain the origin of life, and you can't explain the origin of the universe. Well, neither can you. You just say it's God that did it. You don't tell us how.
Yeah, I mean, we would say, yeah, there was such power there that it was spoken into existence.
Cheap shortcut.
How do you get to the point? Yeah, but from going from a Big Bang to living organisms, how does that occur?
We don't
And
know.
from living organisms to the four of us sitting here having an intelligent conversation about the origins of morality.
Those
Yeah, we don't know how life was created.
Although
We're-
science has made
we're-
enormous
we're studying
progress
it and trying to
in
figure it out,
understanding that in the last 20
Right, we
years.
don't-
Now, theologians have not.
Right, yeah, we fully admit
We
we don't
settled
know
it a
how
long
it
time
started,
ago.
but we can once it did start, we can explain how we got to here through the evolutionary process of random mutations and natural selection.
And just because we can't explain how it originated doesn't mean we never will be able to. And even if we are never able to, doesn't mean it didn't happen by natural processes.
Absolutely.
Mm-hmm.
But
So-
not
so
knowing
the
not knowing is an okay
creationists are-
not knowing is an okay answer.
Yeah,
just
the
have a different
creationists
God
are
called
raising
natural
a
processes.
paper tiger argument, or
Your God is just called natural processes, where mine is called Yahweh.
well, yeah, you just put a personal name on your ignorance, you know. And I think that does it. You've put the question on a higher intellectual shelf where you've agreed not to try to reach it.
Right, but I'd say, where does personality come from if not from a person?
Does that question even mean anything?
I mean, how do you go from that?
Is about, I don't know, 40% genetically derived and 60% socially inculcated. What's your point?
Yeah, my point would be is, okay, here we are, persons. How do you get from non-person to person?
What do you mean by non-person?
A person who is not a human being.
Chimp, I guess. Right?
A person who is not a human being.
Yeah, I mean,
So do you have anybody that you know in particular?
how do you go from, let's put it this way, how do you go from rock to person?
Oh, well, I can show you whole
Well,
libraries of books that will tell you.
I mean, rock itself's an inanimate object, but
Right.
once life was created, we know that, we then start right there with a common ancestor, and through random mutations, once genes came in to, start out bacteria or something,
And selection,
and
followed by selection.
random mutation, and then these random mutations affect how somebody functions, and natural selection then decides based on the environment that entity is in, well, that mutation is going to survive better and longer to reproduce. So the other
Tautological,
yeah.
it's unavoidable.
Okay, so we get to the point where we have a common ancestor with the great apes, and so bonobos and chimpanzees have a common ancestor, and human beings have a common ancestor with that. Apes have a common ancestor with all that previous group, and that constitutes the great African apes. And then orangutans and that whole other group have a common ancestor. So
And there are dozens
So mutations
of
have
lines of
happened
evidence for
yeah.
this.
Mutations have happened in genes over the years that, for whatever reason, has led our species to have a bigger, I hate to say more involved, but a brain capable of higher reasoning, as far as we understand. Are we the pinnacle of creation? Using that lightly term. No, we may not be, because evolution doesn't have a goal.
You know, it's
Evolution is a result of the environment and the situations that
pinnacle,
happen.
or that's a semantic
Yeah,
issue, not a scientific one.
yeah.
Right. And here we've gone 25 minutes. But that's good because we talk about philosophical things here that went a whole lot deeper than government. And I think it does and can get back to, is there a God or is there no God? If there is a God, what are the implications about that regarding government? And does it matter if it is a question to consider regarding government? I'd say two of us say it does, and two others say no.
I think it's quite a good question because factors from both sides, if you will, are trying to influence the legislation, from their perspectives.
Sure.
So it is a big issue.
Yeah, I think it is too. I think it is what you see it in public education, government-run education. I mean, there is a bias there, and that bias is naturalism, not supernaturalism.
I don't think it has any influence at all. I agree or disagree with the man's idea, and I don't care whether he attributes it to a religion or a god, or to a philosopher, or to himself.
And I'll let Norm have the last word on today's edition of the Sophie Scholl Society.